Well, thank you guys for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Cooley with AOS. I sit on the programs committee for ULI. And we're hoping to bring you some interesting content today that's very relevant and will hopefully give you some additional insight on the workplace revolution. I wanted to introduce our two speakers today. The first one you probably know very well is Carolyn Hayes with AOS. She's our VP of Marketing. And she has teamed up with Megan Tuman from Doris, which is a workplace research firm. We began this journey over a year ago, as we all did, when things shifted, and we really wanted to understand, what are we currently going through, and what do we see the next evolution of workplace. So they've gotten together and put together some incredible data, and I want to let them share that presentation with you today.
Thank you, Rebecca. So something that we've recognized for a while is that AOS sits at a really interesting cross-section of design and business and really the human experience. So when we were introduced to the Doris team, and Megan will expand on this in a little bit about their approach, it really aligned with the way that we look at space and how people are using that space. And then with what we have all experienced towards the end of 2020, Megan and her team brought us this really unique study that they had done that took a lot of what we were both sensing and feeling out in the marketplace and in our own businesses and organizations. And they dug a little bit deeper beyond your blanket surveys and all of what we were seeing published at the time. And so that really gave us a new lens with which to really view what we were experiencing and a new way to start talking about where do we go next. But to set the tone for today, I'm going to kick things off with a little video that we think really captures the pivot point that we are sitting at now, that there is evolution is constant, that we have experienced these changes in the way that we work in the past, and that this is only going to continue evolving. And so I will let the video do the rest of the talking for the moment. So while the big question is, what is the future of the office? I think what Doris really helped us wrap our minds around was, that the decisions we make as business leaders today are going to fundamentally affect the way that we work for years to come, and have an immense amount of impact on the way that we both function, but also how we recruit, how we retain, and how we continue to be productive going forward. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Megan to talk a little bit about why we're so excited about these insights.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. As introduced, I'm Megan Tuman. Thank you all so much for your time today. I wanted to give just a little bit of information about Doris, because I'm sure you've heard the word a couple of times and wondering, Megan, Doris, what's going on? So my name is Megan. I work for a company called Doris Research, and we specialize in researching space. So workspaces, campuses, maybe even manufacturing spaces, that sort of thing. And some may want to call us planners. Some may want to call us strategists. We like to just claim that we're researchers. So that's who we are. And what I really want to do is have all of you put your researcher hats on for a moment. And even though you're all camera off, muted, hopefully I've got enough of your attention to have you chat in the chat window for me for a second. And if you take a look at this picture, what I want you to do is send into the chat identifications of what she is doing. So if you are analyzing this photo, what would you say she is doing? We'll just take a minute and see what sort of responses we get. Also, just to forewarn you, I used to be a teacher and I'm okay with awkward silences. Looking at a monitor hub for her laptop, working on a deadline, checking Facebook. Ooh, John, I like that, checking Facebook. Can somebody give me two more answers?
Reading an article.
Possibly an architect profession, reading an article, heads down work. Perfect. Now I'm going to change this slide to the next one. And we're going to do this one more time. Tell me what these people are doing. Collaborating. What else? Brainstorming. Yes, they've got those Post-it notes. Working together on a project. Thank you. A+ students here. So what I think is fascinating, and one of the basis really of a lot of the research that you're about to see, is this idea of, in the previous picture, we really associate that photo with focus work and independent work, and yet our definition of collaboration is sort of encapsulated in the second picture. And yet it's very possible that this woman who's working independently could be collaborating in some way. She could have maybe a Zoom meeting in the background and something, and she's showing them, some sort of architectural or design. And so what's been so fascinating as I've talked to many, many people about this is this idea that we are now working in a way that maybe our mental definitions of how we should work haven't quite caught up to. And so that is one thing that I want to keep in mind, or I would like you to keep in mind as I'm giving this presentation, because it will keep coming back up, especially as we start thinking towards the future and sort of how the definition of how we work might have changed a little bit. And yet some of it still remains the same. So what's fascinating here, right here, you're going to see a big green circle with the word productivity in the center of it. And that's because we were initially approached with the the assertion that people are more productive at home. I'm sure many of you have heard once, if not a lot of times since 2020, that I am more productive at home. I get so much more work done. And so we were asked as researchers to go out and find, is this actually true? So sort of validate those assertions. And as we started designing the study, we realized that productivity is only one small driver in business, and we really needed to broaden our scope to encompass more. So we actually designed the study to research collaboration, creativity, strategy, innovation, and productivity. So we went out to find out how people are working in different spaces and how these 5 different factors were associated with the spaces they were working in. And what we did is we had, I think this is 16 different organizations with 5 individuals from each organization. And what's fascinating here is that the individuals at point in time of data collection, which is Q4 of 2020, were working almost a third home fully, a third in the office fully, and a third fully hybrid. So, and hybrid is both spaces, so home and office. And why this is so great from a researcher standpoint is we could really start comparing the different types of work that were happening in these different spaces. From each of those organizations, we asked for 5 participants. We asked for 1 at an executive leadership level, 2 middle management level, and 2 individual contributors. And on the right-hand side here, you'll see a pie chart that really is just here to show you that the individuals that were in our study are pretty representative of the age range that's in the greater working population right now. So what did we do? And this is sort of what makes Doris unique, as Carolyn started referring to, is that we are founded in design thinking, and we value highly human-centered research. And what does that mean? That means that we don't generally send surveys. We may, but it's always in partnership with interviews, because we are able to gather a much deeper understanding of what's happening when we have 30 minutes with someone. So in this study, we conducted 77 individual 30-minute interviews to really understand how people were working the way they were in the spaces they were working. And then the other interesting thing that we did here is we had each individual download an app onto a personal device. And for 2 standard business days, they recorded their collaborative encounters, whether at home or in the office or workspace. And ultimately, we collected 840 collaborative encounters. And through that, we were able to understand what type of collaborations they were having, how many people were engaged, and what the results of those were. So this is a little bit nuanced and different than what you might see elsewhere.
And what were the results, Megan?
Thanks for asking. What's so fascinating on the next slide is you'll see that those 5 circles that we showed you, which we set out thinking independently, each one of these will function and they'll all be adjusted maybe depending on where you're working. And what was so interesting to us as we started to dive into the data a little bit is that as you adjusted one, you affected the others. And so they weren't independently functioning at all. In fact, they were part of a greater system. And so we looked further into this system as we tried to start defining it. And what we realized is that for businesses, innovation and creativity are really foundational and fundamental to them. This is where new projects, new clients, new services, those are all born out of innovation. And so if we think about long-term strategy, those are born out of innovative, creative ideas. And then once you have those initiatives, they move up this system. So we've got a new, let's say, client or project, we move it up into teams where we collaborate and we strategize how it's going to get done. We maybe define individual tasks, and then that moves up into productivity. And so what stuck out to us here is this idea that we're focused so much on productivity, and yet if we're not filling it from the bottom up, this might be maintaining through a pandemic, let's say, but as if we look forward, future thinking, we might start to run out of new innovative ideas for organizations as a whole.
And this was a real aha moment for especially our leadership team at AOS when Doris came to see us and presented this for the first time. It really put a structure around what we had been feeling, where our project management team felt like they were checking things off the box. They'd never been able to work quicker without the disruptions that they were having. They were craving that independent heads down time. Our leadership team, and when we were thinking about it from a marketing and a business development and a strategy standpoint, we were getting very, very anxious about interactions with clients, getting in front of the right people that we need to be in front of from a business development standpoint, how we were going to maximize the investments we have made in our physical spaces, like the showroom that functions just as much as an office as it does as a place for our community to continue to interact with one another. And so the difference between those productivities and seeing what we were focused on, which those being the fundamentals and some of those generators, and the other end of our team, we were coming from two different directions. And that was really when a light bulb went off and it changed the types of conversations that we were having.
So this slide, why we thought it was important to include this in a presentation. So to sidebar a little bit, there's a 48-page research document that's behind all of this. And so from that, we decided, okay, if we were going to present something, what are the important things to present? And for us, because we are so people-centered and it matters to us, we thought this slide was important because when we were talking to individuals about these business drivers, which can sound like jargon sometimes to people, they kept bringing up the same things over and over again. And so we thought it important to let leadership know and our other clients know that there's an association happening here for people. So first off, starting at the bottom of this pyramid, creativity was also always associated with an energy, producing. So when we're creative and something new is happening, there's an energy that's produced. It's an energizing event. Innovation was all about communication. So if something is going to be truly innovative, then we need maybe a wide variety of perspectives, and we need lots of departments to come together. And so interdepartmental communication became really important. Strategy was all about effort. And this I like to define personally as a two-way effort. And what I mean by that is when you go into a strategic meeting, they're tough. They take effort from you to be truly in that meeting and strategizing how something is going to get done. And at the same time, you're defining the effort that is needed for something to be completed. And so there's really a multiple facets of effort happening in those strategic meetings. Collaboration's all about accessibility and or availability. So all of you have graciously given us your time today. And so this sort of meeting couldn't happen unless we all made ourselves available to be here. Last but not least is this productivity. And this one I think is truly fascinating. And it has spurred many a conversation. And that's because the productivity, when we talk to individuals, when they talk about being productive, they're talking about individual responsibility. I feel productive when I can check tasks off my list. And what the aha moment for us was here is that this was what we lovingly call, let's say, a little p productivity. So individuals feel productive. But when leadership, like Carolyn was mentioning, is talking about this. They're talking about what we call a big P productivity. So as an organization, are we being productive? You might be checking tasks off your list, but are we organizationally still moving forward and being as productive as we could be? And so that was sort of fascinating to us. This slide is interesting in two different ways. So first of all, let me tell you the background of it. During our interviews, we asked each person to rate on a 0 to 10 scale each of the 5 drivers, how well they were working for them in the past, present, and future. And when I think about past, I think pre-pandemic, present, in a pandemic, and then future, let's start forecasting post-pandemic what things are going to look like. And so the two facets that look interesting here to me, and I hope to you as well, is the teal line and the orange line. The teal line represents collaboration and the orange line represents innovation. So I'm going to talk about each one of them independently. So the teal line here is interesting to me because it was the highest in the past, and then it took a collective nosedive. And if we think about the reason why that's showing up the way it is similar to the pictures that we saw at the beginning. People associated collaboration with being in person around a table with Post-it notes and really working something out. And the pandemic has forced us, for the most part, many of us, to go completely remote and digital for these collaborations. And that's painful. And as we all probably can talk about the many nuances of the challenges of this type of collaboration, what's interesting is that as people look to the future, it does get better, right? People are generally hopeful about the future, and yet it doesn't increase back to where it was. And that's really people anticipating that we're still going to have some element of this Zoom world in even when we go back to the office. So we still will be collaborating and might get better, and yet we'll still have some of this virtual element. The other line I like to point out is the orange line, and this is innovation. And the reason this one's interesting is because it's the only increasing line on this entire graph. And when we think about this, let's think about it in terms of little I innovation. So it's the lowest in the past. People are saying, oh my goodness, I can Zoom and I can WebEx and I can Teams, and I'm doing a great job using these new technologies, and they're sort of patting themselves on the back. And then it increases to the future to say, yeah, I think that there's opportunity here for me to continue learning and individually being open to innovation. And why I think that's so important as we are having these discussions is that there is opportunity in there for businesses to think about new ways to work that people might be more open to because of this increase. They are anticipating learning new things, and therefore there's probably an opportunity to tap into that feeling for businesses. So now I will very quickly take you deeper into each one of those facets. We just pulled out one insight from each one. The first one, as you can see up on this left-hand corner, we're going to talk about creativity. And why this graph is here is because coming out of that collaboration data that we talked about, each person for 2 days telling us where and how they were collaborating, one thing that was glaringly obvious to us, so much so that I had to see if there was an outlier. As a statistician, I was like, this isn't right. But it was that people were still going into the office to have creative meetings. And the reason why is that the space is set up to facilitate some of that, and there's less effort, and they just decided we'll mask up and we'll go do this because we've got whiteboards, we've got the Post-it notes, we've got the Sharpie markers, and everything that we need available to us in the space. And so we're going to do that at the office. Similarly with strategic meetings, those were still happening a little more in the office than at home. But what's fascinating to me and starts defining for us the type of work that's happening in these different spaces is that when you look at project related and task oriented, that dynamic flips. And so when you look at project related and task oriented, more people are able or feel enabled to do those types of meetings from home.
So one of the quotes that came out of this study that stood out to us was, creativity is thinking about things differently than we have in the past, looking at things from a different lens. I think that it is, especially in the AEC industry, and when we're talking about how the progress of a project comes to be when we look at those initial phases, it's really significant to us to have those kind of big room meetings, those big room collaborations, the ability to use those tools like Megan was talking about. So much so that it's been really interesting as we talk to clients across the board, how they are then in turn adopting a lot of tools that allow you to do markups in real time and to share that screen and still interact in that way that we would traditionally do with plan and pens and paper and Post-its on the whiteboard and things like that. So there is that energy generation is, I think, really at the root of that. And it was really interesting to us to see that come out of Doris's research. And then as a marketer, I especially hung on to this fact of seeing people in only 2 dimensions doesn't make for the most nuanced relationship building. It's hard to really discern meaning, again, about that energy that you're pulling together when you are in the same room, and that sharing of ideas and emotions. We really noticed how much things get lost in the split seconds that it takes somebody to mute and unmute, and when they have to reframe what they're saying because they just said it and nobody heard it, what that does to that communication flow and to that generation of that energy. And then knowing that so much of our communication is not the words that we say. It's the inflection in our voice. It's the small movements in our faces. It's picking up all of those subtle cues, hand gestures and things for those of us that use that. And so that getting, it changes when you're in this 2 dimensions screen so much, and when you're in such a client-based industry and relationship-based industry. It's something that is really at the heart of why we were so engaged in this research as well.
I know for one, I try to be over emphatic on Zoom. So I'm always like thumbs up to the camera or smile really big so people know I'm engaged. So yes, you're right on with that, Carolyn. All right, moving on to innovation and communication. This one's interesting for two reasons again. One on this slide, and we'll talk about the next one. So this slide is showing a graph of what we call importance performance. So during our interviews, we ask a question 3 times in 3 different ways. So we ask, how important is bringing innovation to work every day for you? And then we asked, how well are you able to do that at home? And then how well are you able to do that at the office? And what was really interesting here, and something that I think is important as a strategy or a talking point as we're moving further into talking with our clients, is they were both significantly underperforming at point in time. So this is Q4 2020, but it really starts to indicate that our mindset is so much so on productivity, and we're not focusing on innovation. And so there's an opportunity here to really start switching ourselves to, what does the future look like? What does innovation look like? Even in the world that we're living in right now.
This quote, necessity is the mother of innovation. We're all learning to work differently. I always, or I have spoken often about just how critical our own showroom manager was in our transition, because she became the point person for everybody that was trying to learn Zoom and Teams and to navigate at-home setups, and and learning that very quickly. And we have various team members that all have various proficiencies with their technology, and comfort levels and how they're interacting with that, and various at-home setups, and all of that came into play. We had, recently introduced quite a bit of software that into our industry that our project managers were adopting. And so in looking at this quote, what that brought up for us was really considering, and something that we've had a lot of conversations with across the board, is that consideration of, one, like, who are your resources to your team to be able to do that, to minimize that learning curve. And everybody's on a different learning curve as they're going through that. And then what is the opportunity as we look forward to, whether it's hold music at the beginning of a Zoom presentation, or it's enhancing those interactions. I think that we have seen that there's a lot of innovation that we're going to have, both on the personal learning level and broader spectrum.
So I'll quickly go through this slide. Basically, the main take-home points are, one, when we ask people to define innovation for us, they use the word "to create," which told us, oh, okay, those two boxes at the bottom of that pyramid are actually not separate at all. They're very, very closely intertwined. But the nuance difference here is in this idea of communicating and gaining a wide variety of perspectives. And if it's truly going to be innovative and new, you've got to really think outside the box, if you will. And so because of that idea, technology can support that, right? We can get regional perspectives. We could get globally different perspectives if so interested. And yet what we're finding is that there are less and less people communicating even interdepartmentally. People are getting very siloed, very focused on their own work, and this opportunity to broaden is there and it exists, and yet we might not be taking advantage of that. Moving up our pyramid into strategy, as I said before, these are effort-filled meetings. And what's interesting about this slide right here is that we really thought that higher leadership would be having the strategic meetings, pushing those down into middle management, and they would be pushing it down, sort of a cascade. And in fact, we were surprised by this this graph that you're seeing right here, because middle managers are holding a majority of the strategic meetings. So instead of it being a cascading effect, they're meeting with a higher leadership to strategize, and then they're meeting with teams to strategize, and they're the go-between. And if we think about the effort that's required in these meetings, this is a group of individuals that really could use a little bit of extra support. And what's fascinating is that this group really talked about how much easier it is in an office space to do some things. So that the idea was space does a little bit of the work for us because of the fact that I know how to get a hold of people. I know if people are available or not, and I can manage and have some of those interpersonal connections in this space when we're all together. So it's really interesting, and it definitely, this slide I think is important as we're talking to clients in a group of individuals that could use a little boost, a little help.
This spoke directly to what we've seen so much in offices where you have open door policies, and we've lowered workstation panels so that you have sight lines all the way across, so that a manager is able to just walk by and pop in on somebody and have that quick conversation. They're able to see if somebody is running around or is heads down, and you lose so much of that in that distance, where they actually have to make that call or or dial in. Um, they talk about strategy being a plan, and planning takes effort regardless of where it's happening. So when we think about, what are the outcomes that we look for and planning for those outcomes, um, that's where I think what was surprising to see, but you very quickly can understand in this research, where that middle manager role sits is that, while they're taking that vision and they're having those conversations about, where are we going long term, where do we need to be in this fiscal year, or whatever metric is using for that business success. And then they have to turn around and they have to say, okay, you're going to work on this, you're going to work on this, and you're going to work on this, and you're going to get it done at this point. That delegation becomes really critical to ensuring success in a plan. When working from home, the space is truly designed for personal comfort. And so not only is there the challenge of space between the communication that's happening with that between team members, there's also, what happens within your space. In this picture, you can see that there's already a different relationship that you're having with your coworker, as pictured here, than you would in the office. And so those impromptu conversations may be more about what is for dinner tonight, or the dog barking outside, or the lawn needing to be mowed in a way that would be different than the conversations that you're having when you walk through the break room and you're talking about needing this or that to finish a project, or how was that meeting with that client that you just had. Those things are kind of changing, and so that requires a lot more intentional conversations in a way that the office space facilitates so organically.
Yeah, so just to redefine these strategic meetings, excuse me, they're usually scheduled, they're intentional, they require effort, they're purposeful. And this last bullet point is really just sort of summarizing what we saw on the graph in a couple of slides earlier, which is really, things get a little bit fuzzier when we can't be together and who's doing what. And so roles and responsibilities, a lot of those are falling on middle management right now. And so it gets just a little bit fuzzier when we're all working remotely. Collaboration and accessibility. This one was really fascinating, though I guess I think all of our work is fascinating, so I may be a little biased, but this one was fascinating because of the fact that we said, all right, we want to know how spontaneous encounters are happening, or if they even are happening in a remote setting. And so through our app, we said, well, where are you having these collaborations, subset into scheduled versus impromptu? And what was interesting is in the office, it was very validating. It was happening in the break room, cafe. You might turn around at your station and talk to a coworker. Mine's not here right now. You might peek your head in an office door and say, hey, do you have a minute? But, and how they were happening. Caroline, next slide. Is very often you would, like I said, peek over or maybe ask somebody or give your 2 cents across the way if you overhear a conversation. Another really important one that we've had many conversations about were what we call the pre-meeting meeting and the post-meeting meeting. So some of these times when you're walking together to a meeting and you have sort of a brief conversation about whatever, or after a meeting when you're walking back to your space and you sort of debrief about the meeting. And if we think about this one as an example, if we were to hang up, it's done. There is no debriefing unless we are in a space together. And so we would have to be very intentional about calling someone and debriefing, and then even so looping in others if we want it to be a larger debrief. So just very different and very much more intentional. So what we had thought about impromptu is that they weren't happening, but what was fascinating is it is happening. They are just, one, asynchronous, and two, happening in a lot of different ways. And so whereas we associate all of it maybe face to face, when it's virtual, we're now maybe web conferencing, we're calling each other, we're texting each other, there's some sort of maybe instant messaging. I'm not sure how many of you can feel this, but my inbox is a lot fuller than it used to be because conversations we might have had previously have turned into emails. And those emails turn into back and forth encounters that we're now emailing back and forth when it maybe could have been a 5-minute conversation and solved all the world's problems. Scheduled virtual meetings are all web conferences. There is nothing surprising on that side, but the surprise came in this idea of we now have this asynchronous nature to our conversations or our interactions. And so with that, there's a time delay. And what happens is we have pain points if we were. So again, we're looking at impromptu performance and importance graphs here. And when we're talking about collaboration in general, at home in the office, people are feeling the pain of it's just a little bit harder to get a hold of each other. So significantly underperforming. But when we ask the nuanced question of impromptu collaboration, at the office, it's performing the way we expect it to. So based on our mental definition of how we do this, it's performing just the way it should. But at home, this is the biggest deficit because we generally don't have rules of engagement. So I should text for this situation, I should call in this situation, and maybe this warrants an email, that sort of thing. So because we're all making it up as we go, that's a little bit further of a gap.
I recently received an email that said, I put this in the Slack channel and I left you a voicemail, and here is an email back to it. And it was one of those moments where I was realizing, like, it's not just Zoom fatigue, it's this electronic communication fatigue and losing track of exactly when did I tell you this, or did I tell you what I needed to tell you? And I'm covering my bases now to make sure that you know what I need you to know. And to that, collaboration, is not a finished, complete task. It's something that doesn't really have a finite end. You can't hang up a Zoom call on a collaboration. It's intentional for the most part, but it's constantly ongoing and in pursuit of improvement. And so, I think that feedback loop, which we'll talk about here, speaks so, perfectly to that challenge that we found organizationally, the ability to collaborate like that, because there's such a, in this space right now, there's all of these disruptions to that fluid collaboration that's happening.
Yeah, what's fascinating to me is this idea that collaboration, when we get together, it produces the tasks, and those tasks generate our productivity. So when I feel productive when I check tasks off my list. And yet, though, for those who productivity is really important, when they collaborate, it feels like they fight with each other a little bit. So if I've been collaborating or in meetings all day, it feels like I haven't been productive. And so there's kind of a challenge that exists within those two, which is really, really pretty interesting. And therefore, that's why we're hearing a lot of people say, oh, I'm so much more productive at home, because they're able to sort of silo some of those disruptions. If somebody calls me, I have the power to take my phone, flip it over, and say, not answering that right now. I'm going to finish what I'm doing. Whereas I don't have the power to do that if somebody puts their head over my, monitor and says, hey, got a question. I need to answer that question. So there's a power dynamic that's shifting a little bit in remote versus in the office.
And to underscore that, productivity is being able to get in and focus on work and projects. Being able to focus on those tasks or processes that move our business forward was a sentiment that came from one of the participants in the study. But it's really interesting. I mean, we observed it today in the showroom where we had a designer in trying to select samples, make fabric selections, work with our project management team. Oh, and then they're going to go on and check how this finish applies to this table. I mean, it was really interactive, and it was in prepping for this presentation, it had my wheels turning in how in our industry that blend of the tactile is so significant to productivity as well. And so how you blend that in a virtual space is very, very different than how you do that in a physical and in an office space.
This one's pretty straightforward, which I think is funny because this is what we had set out to study in the first place. And it really is. People feel more focused when they can work from home, when they have that time to sort of silo themselves, do heads down work. Impromptu collaboration at the office for those that productivity is really important can be seen as distracting. For some, there are less distractions at home. Now, right now is a point in time where that might not be true for everyone, as shown in that picture before, and is my home, hence the reason I'm in the office. And some people really like the control that they have and that their availability is limited. So I have the control to answer when I need to, and to focus when I need to. So we got to the end of this and we thought, so what now what? Great. We have all of this data. What do we do with it? And so what we decided to do is we looked at this system and we thought, how is this entire system affected in different spaces? So we created some scenarios as we were wont to do. So when you look at the following slides, you'll see something that looks kind of like a bar graph. It is not a bar graph. It is really just a representation of how much human effort needs to go into some of these drivers, depending on what space you're in. We also assumed maybe post-COVID healthy culture and communication, and this is sort of my waiver, if you will, my disclaimer, that every organization, this is going to look differently for them, but this is sort of overarching thought provoking. So the first scenario we're going to look at is the office only. So we just want to bring everybody back, right? So on the next slide, you'll see that everything as far as creativity, innovation, collaboration, and strategy, they're all supported by space. So when we build a space for the purpose of working together, it makes it a little bit easier. There's less human effort that goes into some of these collaborative encounters. And yet productivity takes a little bit of a dip because of the fact that it does provide more of that opportunity for collaboration, and those two fight with each other, remember. And so it's a little bit harder to be productive. So we've seen instances of maybe a do not disturb indicator on your desk that says when you're focusing or when you're not, or maybe focus rooms. These are all different things that people do to raise that bar, but that require a little bit of human effort. So everything as far as the first four take a little bit less effort. Productivity takes a little bit of a hit. Innovation and culture need to be well communicated. The reason we have this on here is we are in a moment of time where people are asking for flexibility. And if you have a client that says, nope, we're bringing everybody back into the office, it's going to be extremely important that the why is communicated. Their biggest hurdle is going to be the communication as opposed to anything else. Well, and safety, right? Safety of the workspace, as well as communicating why we're bringing everybody back in.
What's been interesting that we've been seeing is even if you bring everybody back in the office, everybody that you are interacting with may or may not be spending as much time in the office. And so, while all of your internal meetings could be in person, your external meetings are going to have a lot more variability to them. It's interesting. We've even created kits for presentations like this that allow us to adjust the lighting where we need to adjust the lighting, or add microphones, power support for our computers and things, because we've seen so many more of our team members are needing to take these calls and interact in a virtual realm. We're also seeing an increase in inquiries about phone booths or breakout spaces, because if you are in an open plan office, the ability to take a call and not disrupt that person next to you, or to sit on a listening to a call for a period of time without that interruption coming to you. People are asking more and more for kind of those small independent spaces that allow you to have those interactions, that are giving as much of a positive experience to the person on the other end of the screen as you would give to them if you were in the same room.
The next one is the flip. So let's just keep everybody at home. We're all going to be remote. So this works for us. Let's keep everybody on the same page. This is almost exactly the flip of the previous graph that we saw. So productivity is super high. Everything else takes a little bit of a hit, only because of the fact that we have to have a little more pre-planning and be very intentional about how we're going to do these four things. So for example, let's take a creative meeting where we need Post-it notes and Sharpies, and we're going to do brainstorming. We need to figure out how we're going to do that virtually. Do we send everybody Post-it notes and then we show them on our screen? Do we have to learn a new technology to do that, like a Jamboard or Mural? And if we do that, does everybody in the meeting know how to use that? Or do I need to take 10 minutes of my meeting to train? All of those, just not saying it can't be done. It can be done, and we are doing it. It just takes a little more human effort to raise those bars. The benefit of this one, which is the reason I'm pointing this out, is because we're going to talk about hybrid next. And a huge benefit here is that everyone's on the same page. Remember, this is everybody's at home. Some people aren't going into the office. Productivity is maximized, and everybody has that focused time to do work. Again, more effort is needed to schedule those time for collaborations. I don't know how many of you have this same pain point as I do, but I am on a lot of Zoom calls every day, back to back. And there'll be plenty of times where I'll have to tell Caroline, okay, I need 5 minutes. I got to run to the restroom, grab a snack and a water, and I'll be right there. Right. And so there are new challenges that exist in this virtual world. So the key here is that we have to set structures and policies in place to really start to streamline some of this. I know, don't know how much time do we have? Do we have 30 minutes left or 0
Yeah.
minutes? Oh, we have 30 minutes. Okay, so I can tell my story. I'm working with a leadership team right now where we just talked about their communication, and they said, well, everybody knows this stuff. And then within their own team, they were talking about how some people allow texting on their personal cell phones while some didn't. Some were using Teams for instant messaging. Other people didn't get notifications. And this is in their senior leadership team of 5 people. And if we exacerbate that, or, grow that to 100 people, while we assume everyone understands how to function in this virtual world, there will be an opportunity to sort of streamline and create a framework of, send me an email if you want a response in 24 hours. Maybe give me a call if you need a quicker response than that. Everybody needs to be trained on Teams, whatever it is. But in this case, structures and policies will be really important to put in place so that everybody's kind of moving in the same direction.
The other thing that has been very prevalent for us is that, um, all of the physical things that you need that have come to the forefront in recent years, like ergonomics, are still very critical to your ability to be productive throughout the day. So while you're not getting interruptions, we've had lots of questions about seating at home. How long can you sit at your kitchen counter and at a bar stool and still be able, to avoid the pains and things that occur in an office space? Those decisions have been made by a designer or by your architect in the amount of daylighting that you have, in the comfort level of your seat, in the height of your desk. There are not just the physical space that you have and those personal interactions, but there's other considerations to be had. There's also, to take that further, the kind of AV and tech support that you have in an office is embedded into that space, where that's something, and why we've seen so much about at-home setups, and so many of our manufacturers have created portals for ways to access those types of things. We've seen clients that are talking about stipends to be able to send a certain amount to team members to be able to invest, or they're actually sending the setup that they need to be able to do that. And then, of course, you can't have a conversation about at-home setups like that and not take into consideration equity and access to everything from the broadband that supports that work, to the space within your home. Some people are lucky enough to have a separate space that they can designate as an office. Other people are trying to fit that into a floor plan that may not allow for that as much. We've seen lots of beds in the background and rigging of different areas. And so, for long-term success and setting your team up for that, there are many more questions that you get into that setup, more than just, getting on the same page of where everybody will be when you're looking for them.
Last but not least is this hybrid scenario. So again, this is where you have people working at home and at the office. A lot of people are asking for this in terms of flexibility. And so, a lot of organizations are thinking, we want to implement something like this in the future in order to give everybody what they want. What is most interesting to us is that this is the hardest one to implement. And the reason why is because you now have people in different places. So you've taken a level playing field where everybody's coming into the office or everybody's at home, and you've created let's say, inequity in space. And because of that, there are larger challenges that can arise, especially if not planned for. So we're not saying don't do this or you can't do this or there aren't great benefits from it. It's just that it's going to be hard and it's going to take some planning. And so what we do see here is that productivity definitely can be supported because people can choose to do focus work at the place of their choice, maybe. So whether that be if you have kids at home, you go to the office to get your focus work done, or vice versa. So here's the thing. Everyone feels supported in this flexible work environment. This is what people are asking for. We're talking a lot about attraction, retention in terms of flexibility in workplace. It can be preserving to culture in that you are getting people together to see each other in a space. It can maintain productivity because of that reason that I said people will can choose where to work in order to be productive. Here are the key challenges, and what's interesting here is that it looks a little bit dire, but this spurred a whole second study for us because we're so interested in it and because we know it's coming. So first and foremost, communication is going to be really necessary. We got to make sure people understand when everybody's available for collaboration. Who's going to be in the office when, who's not, how are we going to meet? There is a danger of misconceptions. This is sort of an inequity conversation that I actually just had a big debate about in the office yesterday, that especially for managers who are used to managing in person, there can be an opportunity for misconceptions when you don't see somebody as often. And so how are we going to be thoughtful and plan for that in maybe performance reviews and that sort of thing to the future? So lots of sort of pitfalls that we could fall into if we're not strategic about planning it. So I'd like to pause here for a second, Carolyn, if you agree, should we maybe ask for Q&A, or, are there any epiphanies for anybody that's here and has been graciously listening to us for a while?
Yeah, I would encourage everybody at this point, if you want to turn on your camera and we can have some interactive dialogue.
They might be all gone. Caroline, do you want to?
Not all gone. Sorry, technical difficulties, right?
You're fine.
Sorry, I'm Bobby Woolley, by the way. I'm with Bart's office. And so first I want to tell you thank you for putting on this presentation. There's always the back and forth, right? Where are the actual numbers? So everybody says, oh, I'm so much more productive at home, and or I miss the workplace because I miss the collaboration. And personally, so I used to work in sales for a long time at home. And one of the biggest things that I missed was working in an office environment. My home office was in Lake Oswego, Oregon. I would never have an opportunity to get there. And so it was one of the things I missed in that environment, because I felt I grew more as an employee and as a manager whenever I was around my people, and they could actually understand and things just from water cooler talk, right? And so I was very curious about how the rest of the world was going to react, right? It's so much nicer, so I can stay at home, I can be in my PJs. Worst case scenario is I'm putting on a nice dress down shirt, right? And underneath all of that, I have my gym shorts on. And so, but you just don't get the same feel from everybody. And this is nice to see that somebody actually went out and did this type of research. So thank y'all very much.
Oh, you're welcome. I have two questions in the chat that I'm going to read out. One from, they're both from David. One is, was there any data on the effect of commute time on productivity? This one, David, is super fascinating because it's sort of dichotomized. So on one end, you were still expected to show up for your 8 to 5, right? And so your commute time's outside of that. So a lot of leaders were like, I don't worry about commute time. The other interesting thing that we've heard a lot about is boundaries. So people talked about the commute as a boundary that was sort of set up to switch from home life to work life, which is blurred a little bit more when you're working from home. And so people are talking a lot more about working longer hours because they're Zooming and then they're answering email, and it's really sort of adding to their day. And so it's really been fascinating to look into that commute, which we have done, is what I'm telling you. And it's really been an interesting thing because I think what it ends up being is a wash in terms of time worked versus not. And also when you take into affect, let's say, the qualitative aspect of the boundaries of work time versus home time, and that those are getting blurred, I think it's been interesting because it's not cut and dry. Next question, have you looked into how new platforms like Clubhouse allow for interaction, networking, and engagement while remote? No, is the short answer of that. I have not, but I would love to talk more about that and see what your thoughts are and what opportunities lie for Doris in that. And then the next one is any data on introverts versus extroverts. And that actually is showing itself more in our second study than it did in our first. So I think we'll talk about that here at the very end, but our second study is called Hello Hybrid. And we've asked people a lot more about, let's say, mental health and support and that sort of thing. And there is such a diverse range of how supported people feel, whether at home or at the office. And it really gets down to some of that introvert extrovert. So if I'm an extrovert, I'm really missing people and not feeling quite as supported by my organization because I'm not having those conversations. Introverts are loving it because they can hang out at home and they can kind of have that screen as protection. And so there is some data, not in the first one that we're talking about, but there's some more interesting findings in the second one. Thank you, David, for asking your questions. Appreciate it. David's at a conference in Louisville, Kentucky now. He lives in New Orleans. He was on Clubhouse during meeting breaks because, oh, you're learning more from Clubhouse than the conference. Oh my goodness. Okay, David, full disclosure, I've only heard about Clubhouse from YouTube. And I've heard that it's the new thing. And so I'll have to look into it a little bit more, but I'm very interested in this. I would love to offline. I'll give you my information. Carolyn, do you want to tell us some about your guys's top takeaways?
Yeah, absolutely. So our first top takeaway from this study was essentially that the collaboration was defined by interviewees as the act of working together to create tasks or progress towards a goal. This is easier to do in person because there are more organic opportunities for spontaneous collaboration. For us, we are in such an open environment. We are so collaborative as a team that, it was a real takeaway in how we worked together and how we generated that, visibility was much easier in person. And that energy really is at the root and the heart of our culture as a company. And so trying to find a balance for that over this past year. And as we think about what we're going to be doing going forward, the spontaneous collaboration is a really significant part of that for us. We latched on to that little P big P so quickly when it was described to us. Really understanding that so many of our own people feel as though they're more productive at home because having that control over the environment, we're working in detailed work that requires a lot of focus to ensure that every part and piece is in place to make sure that, everything is documented and in writing. Email was critical to us before we had space between us from really moving projects along. And all of that takes time and concentration to be able to execute. So finding that balance between what we can do within a day um, and how much of that heads down work do we facilitate, and do we give people the opportunity to control, so that they can do that in a way that is best for them, and how much do we build in that structure that allows us to interact with one another and to ensure that we aren't spending our entire time lining our schedules, and just making sure we can find a time to meet, that we find ways in which we're able to do that naturally in this shifting environment. And then for us, really thinking about collaboration, creativity, innovation, strategy, and productivity in that pyramid, in that continuing cycle, in the fact that each one is not only a part of a complex system, but you really cannot have one without the other. And so rather than throwing spaghetti at the wall and trying to just answer this question about to hybrid or not to hybrid, who's going to do what, when are they going to do it, that we really think about sustainable drivers in that structure and how we're building a strategic approach that is as beneficial to our client experience as it is to our employee experience and vice versa.
We did have one more question that I wanted to ask our speakers today. Do any of the studies include projections on co-working?
I answered Jill. I said we don't have necessarily projections. What we've done is, here it is on this slide, talk about the toolkit. We did a whole second study about hybrid, and one of the big things that is going to be important for organizations to figure out is whether they're going to utilize co-working spaces as an option for themselves, as opposed to maybe having a central hub, but allowing people to use co-working spaces. And I think that's going to be really individualized to the organization and to what their, let's say, priorities or strategies are and how people work, especially if, let's say, collaboration is going to be really important, then it's going to be important that they utilize the co-working spaces almost like satellite offices. So you have a group of people that are going there, not just for focus work, but to really get together and to strategize. So I'm sure you've been talking to people about that strategy, Jill. Yeah, so Caroline has it here, and I sort of started alluding to some of these conversations I'm having. We're engaging leaderships and helping them to figure out how to build their hybrid model for themselves specifically. And what was born out of that second set of research is this playbook that really is designed to be a tool to help leadership make some decisions. And then partnered with, and in my opinion, even better leveraged is when we get leadership together to have workshops and to have an external facilitator sort of talking through some of these decisions, and it's not placed on maybe one person or a couple of people to be figuring everything out on their own. So the playbook, what we're sort of proud of here is the fact that most people are starting with what we're calling the big questions of how much hybrid are we going to do? Where are we going to work? Who's going to work there? And through our research, one of the big things we've found out is that this is only going to work if we figure out some general large concepts such as trust and accountability and what are our values as an organization? What sort of culture do we want to promote? How do we build equity in this new model? And so we start there, which is called Let's Talk Trust. And then we move through the rest of the decisions, kind of doing check-ins every time we make a decision on, are we actually supporting those foundational elements of trust and accountability and equity? So we start there. And then we work through all of those nitty-gritty details that everybody's trying to figure out right now, but giving a framework within which to make decisions. And that framework is on the right-hand side of this slide. So we start with a warm-up, and it's funny because we've had many people say, well, why do we have to do this? And the idea behind a warm-up, it does have scientific reasoning behind it. And we have studies in the reference portion, but it really tells us that you need to switch your focus. I can tell you, going from Zoom call to Zoom call, that it's hard sometimes to switch off what I was doing before and go to focus on what I need to do in this next one. So we ask everybody to do a warm up. It's kind of fun, and it just gets you engaged in the topic that we're working on there. And then we give all of the research findings and the content as to why we have set everything up the way we did, and why it's important to make the decisions you're about to make. And then there's some sort of activity where we ask leadership to work through that activity to help them make the decisions that they need to. I think of this sort of like a workbook at school, but not. And then every chapter ends with an action and communication plan. So how are we going to enact the decisions that we've made? How are we going to communicate this to the wider population? And who's going to be in charge of that?
So it's really interesting. We've got two comments in the chat. One from Courtney talking about the downside of that she's found when people are working from home is people changing their schedule to fit their personal needs, making it impossible at times to get important meetings put together on the fly. So, you know, the playbook really does ask a lot of those questions and goes through you know, what are those expectations that you're setting in both of those environments, whether you're in the office or you're outside of the office. And you'll see here, they've even broken out some workshops about that kind of collaboration and availability is an entire section, speaking to your point there, Courtney, where people are finding that frustration across the board. In that sometimes you just need to talk about something right then and there. And how do you get in touch with that person when you need to have that conversation, or when 3 or 4 people or 5 people need to be having a conversation at once, so that you're not creating that telephone effect. And then David's talking about what's hard about hybrid is people used to want a conference call. Now they want Zoom, Meet, Teams, Blue Jean, etc. I can step into the hallway for a phone call with mobile or in my call, but I can't log into a webinar as easy. It's easy at my desk at home, but not if I'm mobile. So thinking about, you know, all of the people that are in the field or between client meetings where they're going on job sites, touring clients through spaces, and how you're able to balance that between these different calls and where the priority is to be, and then having that kind of setup. So back to those rules of engagement, David, to your point, Doris has another entire chapter in this book about that, because I love the way there's a statement in the book talks about hybrid as a game of whack-a-mole. And the visual has stuck with me because it truly is. And we've gone through that in our own leadership team, where you answer one question. Okay, we're all going to use Teams. And then we get into trying to present on Teams to a larger audience, and we realize, okay, we're not all using Teams. We need a better setup if we're going to do a presentation to a larger group. Okay, now everybody's using Teams internally, but we're only using Teams or Zoom externally. But then you've got people that have a familiarity with Zoom, and they're coming. I mean, it started where you answer one question and 5 more pop up. And so what the playbook does, and what I think is really brilliant about Doris's approach, both to the 2 studies that they've done, but also to the tools that they're handing over, is they're not giving you a book of answers, because nobody has the answers for your company other than yourself. Is they're giving you a lot more questions to be able to ask, to premeditate the challenges that you're going to come up against, and to think more holistically about those drivers and the impact of those drivers throughout the strategic planning for the future. I recently was reading a study from Microsoft that came out that cites that over 40% of the global workforce is considering leaving their employer this year. That really underlines the fact that a thoughtful approach to hybrid work is really going to be so critical to attracting and retaining diverse talent in our firms, in our industry, in our region as a whole. And so having some of the tools like Doris has put together, I think are really critical into us coming out of this smarter, more productive, holistically, and I think stronger as a community.
Yeah, what I think, we're running out of time, but I would love to continue talking. I could talk about this for days. We actually, out of some of this, we built an extra workshop, which is not listed there, but I wanted to put it here. Caroline's learning about it right now. That is solely built to create empathy between leaders and stakeholders or individual contributors or employees or whatever you'd like to call them. But what we're finding is this big P versus little p idea is really sort of exacerbating some issues. And the idea is to start engaging both levels of organizations in decision making to really start to build consensus and build morale and help with some of that retention that I think, everybody's just trying to figure it out. And so we're trying to help them do that in a way that feels streamlined. It takes a little bit of pressure off of leadership in doing so.
Oh, David's self-employed. He can't quit.
I have no solutions for you, David. Just kidding.
Well, if anybody has any last questions, speak now. With that, I want to thank you, Megan and Carolyn, for sharing this content today. And I want to thank everyone that tuned in and contributed to the conversation. We really appreciate it. And if you have any additional questions, you see the emails and phone numbers on the screen. Take a screenshot and feel free to follow up with them after the presentation. So if that's it, then we'll just say everyone have a nice evening.
Yes. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank y'all.
Thank
Thanks.
you.